This pinwheel experiment was conducted on June the 16th, 2022. Temperature was relatively mild. During the time of the experiment, it varied from 78 degrees and it fell to 74 degrees. So the difference between the indoor and the outdoor temperature was not very high, and that shouldn't be a factor in this experiment. We are following advice from Eric Dullen. So the pinwheel was placed inside this glass jar. It's open at the top. Here's the names of the pinwheel. Alice is inside the glass jar. Lefty is here in the center. On the right is Smiley, which is paper. The paper is slightly heavier than the aluminum. It's more difficult to activate it than it is to turn the aluminum. But strangely enough, during an early phase of the blink experiment in March and April, this paper pinwheel was turning more rapidly than the aluminum. Now we've moved into a latter phase where the center aluminum pinwheel was most active and achieved a lot of record activation levels. Activation being the blink camera turning on to record the pinwheels turning. That's our measurement strategy. Every time it's set so it will record for 25 seconds. It's set so that it can only activate once every 60 seconds. So here's the setup. The previous setup for the last two experiments, we've removed the glass jar over Alice here on the far left, and the camera is normally set up over here. Here's the setup for this particular experiment on June the 16th. Glass jars in place. Here's Alice in the center. Here's the camera right here set behind a mirror, and it's leaning up against the mirror. So we have two mirrors for this session. That's how we started off. There's very low level of activations going on previous to this experiment. There had been one on Friday, one on Monday, then one in the morning of Thursday. So this is a record for the lowest number of activations per day during the non-group day meetings. This is an unusual experiment. There's a lot of equipment malfunctions going on, perhaps anomalous. We can't really say. There's only been one previous activation at 8:38 before the experiment. In the afternoon, I checked the pinwheels using the blink system. They were still. Made a documentation of that. Then at 1901, I began setting up the cell phone camera and made sure that the audio was functioning properly. Then I made two Zoom observations. In other words, Zoom has a system for recording, documenting what the Zoom camera. The Zoom camera is my cell phone camera that I put in the room. The blink camera is separate from that. It activates when the pinwheels turn, and it sees motion in the room. So we made an observation with the Zoom camera. I pound on the door of the room. I don't even open it, and that documented that all three pinwheels were still. Now I found that the camera angle wasn't exactly the way I wanted it. So at 7:09 and 7:10, I went back and I adjusted the camera angles, and then when the group started meeting, I found that the blink camera wasn't recording any sound. So I went back in the room and at 8 o'clock and adjusted the cell phone camera to correct that audio malfunctioning. And then we have an activation of the blink camera, and then for some reason the audio stopped functioning again. And then at 8:13, the camera stopped working. It was overheating, the cell phone camera. So I went back in the room and made an adjustment, and I took away the second mirror, and then soon afterwards there's another possibly anomalous activation, and you'll see that what the camera recorded. Then at 8:48 there's another activation. There's only three actual blink activations, which could be regarded as naturally, activating those three times. Then we made observations later in the evening at 9:30, and found that Alice started turning about a minute before 10 o'clock, but I was unable to document that. Then we have 2 documentations of Alice turning inside the glass container. Then I removed the camera at 10:07. So a very unusual session because I had to enter the room so many times and had a lot of equipment malfunctioning going on. So here's a video of the setting up of the camera. You see my hand putting the camera in place. You should see my image there in the mirror, and you'll see the pinwheels remain still. And now sometimes they're agitated by me getting close to them, but there's something kind of unusual in this particular session. Okay, here's at 7:05. I'm in the room, and this center pinwheel suddenly becomes extremely agitated, doing 1 3/4 of a turn, which is unusual because I'm not close to it at the time. You can't see my image in the mirror. So it's, and we see a little bit of activity here inside the glass jar. Alice, there's some slight movement. So the group's talking, and we're noticing the pinwheels are turning, but perhaps they're not turning fast enough because the blink camera was not activating. So I was concerned because sometimes it seems as if the blink camera is malfunctioning, and it could be that with a paranormal force or whatever, it seems to have the capacity to stop my system from working. So at 8:10 we have the first activation. Let's look at it. But we don't have any audio for some reason. So we have a 3/4 turn of this aluminum pinwheel and a slight movement of the Alice pinwheel. Then 3 minutes later, the camera, which is distinct from the blink camera, my cell phone camera overheated and it shut down. So I went back into the room to fix that. And then not long afterwards, we had a blink activation.
Really, like it wasn't doing its job. Really, before I left. But that's not what I was trying. And I got back yesterday morning at 9:30, and I really felt a distinct energetic difference come from my mental body and then from my aura. And I thought, this is really interesting. And then it really showed up when I was getting reading today.
So this is the strongest activation turn that we have during the session, and so we might make an inference that the entities or spirits or whatever, they're very much interested in Heather talking about giving readings and having psychic impressions. Also, we're planning to mail out these rocks. We're going to mail them around so everyone gets to touch or hold a rock, and we'll create some kind of group unity, or hope to, by doing this. And while I'm talking about this, the pinwheels are turning, but the blink camera did not activate. So here we have it, 8:48.
You can see right in that camera. Yeah. Yep. That's true. I'm curious about that. But I think it's right. You want to be present and personal.
So we're talking about Melanie's dog. So the group session ended at 9:30. Pinwheels were still. They remain still. I'm looking at them through using the blink camera system, which allows me to observe them. Then a minute before 10 o'clock, which is an important time, that's when I document. I'm counting the number of activations from 7 to 10. And so here at 10, we have this movement of the Alice here, and the aluminum is turning. Both clockwise. Now previously, lefty, our aluminum pinwheel was turning counterclockwise, and that's somewhat unusual, but now it's happening more frequently in the last few weeks. So this is a long video. This goes for 1 minute and 43 seconds. But we're interested in this because I missed documenting the really strong turning, and I'm capturing a slower turning. But that's equivalent to a half a turn in 25 seconds, and we have many blink activations of that rate of turning. So it could be that this glare on the glass has prevented the blink camera from seeing that movement, and that this aluminum pinwheel is not moving rapidly enough to activate the blink camera. That would be my hypothesis for this situation. But I think the camera would have activated if this glass weren't over there, if it were able to see it, if the blink camera were able to see this turning better. So this activation didn't occur naturally. I activated it myself because I wanted to document this turning. So the question is, can it turn inside that glass container? And the answer is yes, it most definitely can. And here's another activation. Lefty turns a little bit. We'll see Alice do 1 3/4 of a turn in 72 seconds. That's equivalent to about a 7/8 of a turn. And that speed should have activated the blink camera, so apparently this glare stopped that from occurring. So in those previous 2 experiments, we noticed that this center pinwheel, it would turn, and Alice here, who was out in the open, was less likely to turn, and we seem to be getting more for this. The focus of attention on this pinwheel seems to be activating it. We'll have to see what happens in the future, more experiments from this area, but it does seem to be a tendency of, if you're paying attention to something, you're focusing on it. So here's the end of the session. It's after 10 o'clock, so I'm removing the cell phone camera. And we see Alice move a little bit. You can see my image in the room. And I take the camera away. So here's the discussions, very low activation rates previous to the session. There's only 3 activations during the session, and that's a new record for infrequent activations. The previous low was 5 activations. In the early phase of the blink experiment, we had very few activations, and so it seems like we're returning to that that level of activation level. There's a huge amount of technical problems, audio failures, the camera overheating. Never before have I had this type of problem, so many failures. The pinwheels seemed to, they moved in a manner that seemed to avoid activating the blink camera, because there was pretty much turning during the session. They were turning, they just weren't turning rapidly enough. The pinwheel turned in the open jar. The highest activity was not documented, and that happens when I'm using my my iPad. Sometimes I observe, and then when I try to record that observation, I can't seem to record it for some reason. Anyway, after 10 o'clock, we got those 2 documentations of the pinwheel turning inside the glass jar.